Well, good morning everyone, welcome to our coffee morning. And I was playing with ideas for the talk this morning of sort of, well, do you know where you are? But you'll see why I was thinking down that road as I go through. I was asked to do the talk initially as a talk for Peabody because a so-called expert that was coming on the call with us had been given some misinformation about the history of Thamesmead, and so I said that's rubbish. And I'd already looked up things for another church, and so this is where this came from. So we're starting with where do we live? It's a brief history of Thamesmead and a brief history of this church itself. But that doesn't mean to say that's only a couple of years worth. So the new town of Thamesmead, as I'm sure most of you are aware, is now about 60 years old. It was first started in the mid-60s, or dreamt of in the mid-50s, started building in the mid-60s, and the first resident moved in round about 67, and that was over in South Thamesmead. But people have lived and worked here from the very earliest of times. As I said to someone yesterday, you know, this place has been here since the world was created. When they were excavating the new road from Belvedere to Erith, they unearthed the remains of a wooden railway. That's basically, it was a line of logs, but it unusually had logs down the side to stop the carts rolling off the track and into the marsh. So it was classed as a railway. And that was dated back to the Bronze Age, which is really before certainly recorded history in the British Isles. It was used to drag wagon loads of peat out from the marsh, which would then be dried and they could use it for cooking and heating. And that's how it was known. That's why the new road running into Erith up to the fish roundabout is called Bronze Age Way, because that was where they dug it out and found this track. But there's also, in various places around this area, there's been evidence that Romans knew the area well and had a settlement before they travelled upriver to Londinium. They would stop in this area. When Lesnes Abbey was first founded, the marshes were part of the estates for the abbey. They were the grazing area mainly for the abbeys. They even get mentioned in the Domesday Book, which is what, after the 1066 invasion, that was the first national census ever in this country. When Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries, because they wouldn't pay him his taxes more than because the Pope wouldn't grant a divorce, Manor Farm was created, and that farm managed much of this grazing land right up to the first laying of the brick to create Thamesmead. It was called Manor Farm for a large chunk of it off Yarnton Way. For a short time that became a transport depot because the farm wasn't viable. But the oldest map I could find was this one, which dates back to the Lesnes Hundreds, which was an old name for a sort of parish. And so that dates from the 1400s. Henry VIII also created the Royal Docks, one of which was in Woolwich, and the old gateway, if you're not aware, is just along from the ferry. The old dockyard gateway is still there. He also founded the Royal Arsenal in Woolwich, which at the time was obviously several miles out of London. All manner of cannons and firearms were made there, and every single cannon will be test fired by dragging it out into the marshes and fired. If it exploded, then only the poor gun crew were at risk. But if it worked, they could deliver a working weapon to whoever had ordered it. To aid this, 2 large brick walls were built, which is what the little red lines where they are, or roughly where they are. 2 big brick walls were built as targets. And this is the one in Galleon's Health Centre car park. And if you look at it closely, you can't see in this picture so much, but particularly on the left-hand side, there's round dents in it where cannonballs actually hit the target. So that's why these walls are 300 odd years old and are historic monuments. That's why there's a dirty great wall in the car park. So the other one is behind the Woolies Poly Boys School. If you look closely, so you can see the cannonballed holes, you can see other damage on them, and right up to about the 1960s they were still making guns, cannon and field artillery and dragging it out into the marshes. We had a friend we knew in the church where we met, who he was in charge of. He was never in the army, but he was in charge of the gun crew that used to go and test fire these guns. So we know it was happening right up into the 60s. It probably stopped in the mid-60s because probably people living around here wouldn't appreciate being shelled, and certainly the construction workers would have been unhappy about it. The bend in the river is known as Galleon's Reach, and there's places both sides of the river with several places both sides of the river with similar names, which is confusing. As I found when I was working there one time, and I said, which side of the river are you? Because every name you just read out to me is on both sides of the river. But it comes from the fact that this was the furthest up the Thames that the big armoured galleons could reach under their own power. They could be then towed by smaller boats and rowboats and that further up to the docks, but they couldn't get beyond this under their own power. And so they tended to moor here, and when those ships reached the end of their lives, they would demast them, take the masts out, and they started using them as prisoners. The advantage of this was, particularly during the Napoleonic War, they could put the prisoners on there, and if the prisoner escaped off the ship, he had 2 miles of marshes both sides of the river to try and get through. So anyone who escaped deserved to. That was the attitude. I say, because there are some very deep marshy bits still on Thamesmead. Charles Dickens knew this area, and the opening end of the book Great Expectations talks about a prisoner escaping from these galleon hulks across the marshes, and he would come south, because Dickens didn't know Essex as well as he knew North Kent. And he also talks about the Bull public house on the top of Shooters Hill is mentioned quite a bit in The Tale of Two Cities. So Dickens obviously knew this area quite well. But said probably where we're sitting now would have been that route he described as the prisoner, I can't remember his name, the prisoner escaping from the hulk across the marshes this would be the route to dry land. The demand for munitions led to developing and expanding the armaments industry. And obviously with the First World War, Second World War, and Crayford and the Marshes became the site of the Vickers Armstrong factory, which was more in Erith than here, but still they were test firing and building and expanding across these marshes all over. Built there from the late 1890s. They were building aircraft in World War I and afterwards. A Vickers Vimy, which was a big 4-engine bomber in the First World War, got to a speed of about 60 miles an hour when it was in the air. It was the first aircraft to be able to cross the Atlantic in 1919. And that aircraft was built in Erith on these marshes. Less well known is the fact that Mr. Armstrong, the chap who owned the factory, built and successfully flew a steam-powered aircraft back in 1894, some 10 years before the Wright brothers got something heavier than air off the ground. It was being tested on this track, and the ropes broke, and it reached a record-breaking 42 miles an hour before it took off and managed to crash 200 feet away. But that was technically the first heavier-than-air flight. So before these Yankee upstarts did it. Convict labour was frequently used back to the Napoleonic times again to fill up the swampy land and try and do landfill. And material was often excavated from the royal docks further up Woolwich and beyond. Land reclamation in some form or other was happening all the way through World War I and II. Additional strengthening and raising of parts of the riverbank up to Crossness was carried out in World War II, and a lot of that came from, in a way sadly, the flattened houses and factories in South London and East London, all that rubble had to go somewhere, and it got tipped into the marsh as landfill. So you're sitting on a bit of Southwark and a bit of Barking or somewhere that's all got flattened then. In more recent times, the Luftwaffe helped the area by dropping a large tonnage of bombs on their way in to hit the London docks, but their navigation was never that great and a lot did land on the marshes. And then after World War II, just to add to the fun, the MOD decided to get rid of a lot of their spare ammunition, and lorry loads were just tipped into the soggy marsh as landfill as well. So even now we have to tell people when they start building and driving piles in, if something goes clang, don't assume it's a hard stone, it could be explosive. It is a dangerous place to dig. In fact, the 140 houses where Carol and I live, at least 6 people have dug out Tudor cannonballs from them, which gives you an idea of the sort of muck that's in the marsh. In 1953, is before my time, honest. In 1953, a mixture of weather conditions created what's called the North Sea flood, which caused massive devastation and knocking things over, and loss of life in Holland and Belgium, and 2,000 people died. About 200 in Essex, and 1 person on Thamesmead. The water finally subsided. It literally came down from the North Sea, down the Channel and up the Thames, and finished and died out by the time it reached here. The person who died here was a night watchman who'd been told to go back to his back home because this flood was on its way, because obviously they had plenty of warning here. And if for some reason he went back to his hut to get something and died of a heart attack. He didn't actually drown. But there are records of travellers being rescued from up to 7 foot of water nearly 2 miles from the river. And this picture here is actually what that was Belvedere Football Ground, which is now B&Q and Asda, which is why the road is so high and you drop down into the car park there, because that was part of flood defences, because you can see how deep that water was, and that's nearly 2 miles inland there. That's a lot of water and a lot of land to cover. Following this flood, not surprisingly, the MPs in Westminster felt a little bit vulnerable, and they drew up plans to build the Thames Barrier, a large raisable concrete wall that would create a barrier of water surging upstream towards Westminster and bouncing it back safely for Westminster. Because where's that water going to go? Hi. And at the same time, in typical council thinking, let's build new homes on the marshes as the overflow estate, because Abbey Woods was built to house the soldiers coming home from the Second World War, and that's full, so let's expand it onto the marshes where we're going to put all this water when it floods. Yep, that makes sense. London County Council, the LCC, which not long after became the Greater London Council, or the GLC, surveyed this area and began hammering piles into that marsh as foundations for future buildings. And even now, a lot of buildings have to be built on those foundations. And you can see on some of the satellite photos, you can see these funny lines running across where you can see these lines of piles exist. Growing up on the side of Shooters Hill through the 60s, every time we opened the front door, you could hear this donk, 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 which was the Thamesmead being built. Took me ages to realise, put the two together, but yeah, that was what the sound you could hear non-stop. By about 1967, as I said earlier, the first houses had been built and the very first tenants moved in. At the time, the areas were just called Stage 1, Stage 2, Stage 3, which is largely South Thamesmead and the flats sort of round here. Families were carefully chosen to have this new start in this new estate from all over London. It was a privilege to be allowed a place on Thamesmead. Many of the official history starts with the buildings running alongside Harrow Manor Way, starting in 1967, Coraline Walk and Binsey Walk, both now demolished, with the houses and the towers behind it. My house is just beyond that and was built in 76 as the first private builder started building. So that gives you an idea of the age of South Thamesmead. By 65, the first LCC scheme consisted of a series of villages built at first floor level on huge concrete platforms with garages, stores and service areas at ground level. The planned scheme included a number of 30-storey tower blocks flats at the junctions of the platforms, which were linked with bridges, all in case of flooding. Certainly in Bexley it was illegal to live on the ground floor for many years. Now you're not supposed to sleep on the ground floor for flooding risk. Then the MOD agreed to sell the rest of their land on the north side of the Ridgeway to the GLC, and the Woolwich Erith project, as it was then called, was completely redesigned. This new scheme was an extended version of Coraline and Binsey walks, gradually rising to 9 and 10 storeys as the river was approached. High-level pedestrian walkways with high-level decks was to complete the scheme. Still we know the area is going to get wet. The first 3 stages were designed with an eye to rapid industrialised building, concrete, and the form evolved very much in tune with the architectural and planning thinking of the time. Eventually, however, a combination of increasing costs, change of political control, and a desire expressed by residents for a more human-scale environment led to an abandonment of this urban idea and its replacement of tower density by houses with gardens. What a novel idea. That philosophy was very similar to the garden city thinking of pre-war days. It's what they discovered during the Industrial Revolution. The coal miners and steel workers were happier if they had a little garden to go home and play in and grow their vegetables in. The innovative design, as it was, some people think it was, of high-level walkways was necessary because the area could still flood, and all homes had to have access at first floor level for safety. Even the schools were designed to have high ground for evacuation, which is why you have that high wall all the way along Yarnton Way. So even the schools had high ground to get to for safety. Because you've got to remember, when did they move in? 67? It wasn't until 1989 that the Thames Barrier and all the associated riverside defences were finally completed. That's 20 years of being at risk getting drowned. And now there's serious consideration that those walls need to be higher, if not a foot. Some people are arguing it should be 3 foot. So we still have a risk of flooding here. Sadly, by the mid-1970s, Thamesmead had become a dumping ground for London's problem families, because each council was offered 12 homes each year. So Greenwich and Bexley only got 12 homes each, and so all the other boroughs realised if we get rid of our troubled family over there, instead of the pick of the crop, you got the worst of the bunch, and that brought the reputation of Thamesmead down very, very rapidly. Not helped by, I don't know whether anyone has seen, I hope you haven't recognised this film, a classic film called Clockwork Orange, which was filmed around Coraline Walk particularly, and features mind control and thugs dressed like this going around and mugging people in all the alleyways. Does that sound familiar to the news reports around here today? People dressed strangely and mugging people in the alleyways seems to be a common theme. And that was the problem, and because of this reputation and a don't care attitude, Thamesmead gets, who wants to live on Thamesmead attitude, where people come over here and, wow, didn't realise it was so nice, or can be. And one of the side effects of this was, or this film particularly, when they were demolishing Coraline Walk to get all these squatters out of it and so forth, people were coming up and asking for a piece of concrete because they liked the film Clockwork Orange. And they could have made a fortune selling scraps of concrete. Much of the early parts of Thamesmead are now being demolished because that concrete construction has developed what they call concrete cancer, which is basically the rusting of the iron bars in the concrete, reacts with the concrete and it all starts crumbling. Coraline Walk, part of the reason for emptying it and pulling it down was if someone slammed their front door, there was a danger of a lump of concrete falling off the other end of the building. That was the danger of it. Despite protests from local residents, the switch from concentrated housing that started Thamesmead to low-rise houses with gardens is now being reversed. But if you noticed, all the new buildings are going back to tall blocks of flats with no green space around them, which is not very nice. Mixed with the high price per unit, the whole population and character of Thamesmead appears to be changing yet again. What's in the future? Some say we should pull everything down and start again. Others have different ideas, but perhaps this one's not quite so practical that we wait for the UFO to come and blow up Thamesmead. This is actually an advert for, I think, for sports gear. But Sally suddenly spotted this one time and we thought this is quite an amusing view of how to deal with Thamesmead. But that is literally, and actually on there you can just see my house. In the left-hand corner over here, right over far corner, that little white blob is my house, which is usually cut out of all these pictures around the lake. And basically the previous picture was filmed that end of the lake, around there. So it's a popular filming site around here. Right, where are you now? Where precisely are you in this building? Now, English can be a funny language with one word being used to mean two different things. A school can be the building, or it can be the teachers and pupils in it. Ditto for a church. Thamesmead was designed for a growing population, and plots for schools, shops, healthcare, some playing areas, some parks. Unfortunately, the GLC weren't keen on churches. And the original plans basically wanted two ecumenical buildings. And ecumenical, if you're not aware, means mix everything together, is a simple explanation. So they gave two plots to church. One, the Church of the Cross, was to be shared and is still shared between Anglican, United Reform and Methodists. Currently they have a Anglican minister, previously it was a Methodist minister there, and so forth. And the other church just down the road is St Paul's, which is sort of shared by the Anglicans and the Roman Catholics, although they didn't play nicely, and so they have two separate worship areas in the common hall. But that was what originally wanted. But as you may have noticed, this is a Baptist church, and Baptists weren't included in this. And after a long fight by what was actually a very strong voice in the community, and has been for a long time in Woolwich, leads us to the history of Titmuss Avenue. Back in the 1740s, I know that says 1760 because that was the rebuilt building. Back in the 1740s, Baptists were regularly meeting in people's homes in the Woolwich area, despite technically that was illegal, because you had to go to an Anglican church or a Roman Catholic church or a Methodist church because they were semi-licensed. And so they were meeting in people's homes, and that was breaking down. So original Baptists came from Reformation clerics who started churches in an English-speaking church in Amsterdam, of all places. And they'd eventually come back to London and were, meeting in Woolwich. And in 1746, they finally got permission to buy a plot of land by the Thames, and Enon, the church by the riverside, was built. That was what it was known as, the church by riverside, but equally that is what Enon means. The church grew quite quickly in numbers. As I said, in 1767 was quite extensively rebuilt, but still on the same plot of land. And this was literally a stone's throw from the river, right down by the Woolwich Ferry. For a variety of reasons, after a few years, there was a bit of a disagreement in the church and they split, and a second Baptist church was formed just up the hill from the Woolwich Dockyard Gate. And that was then sort of known as West Woolwich Baptist Church, which is also why it's West Woolwich, and you have Woolwich Central Baptist Church, and you have East Plumstead Baptist Church. The north, south, east, west comes from this original spreading out of the Baptist churches. And And fairly soon, both churches were planting little chapels. At one point, looking on a map, there seemed to be a Baptist chapel at the end of a road with a pub, and most roads seem to have pubs on them, so they were doing quite well for Baptist chapels. But as the area around the dockyard was being redeveloped, and all along the riverbank, and they wanted to change from the side-loading paddle steamers to the modern ferry ramp you've got, there were problems, and the churches were in the way. West Woolwich Church got a new building built by the council for them, and in the 1950s the Enon Church had sort of ceased to be really effective at all, and so it was just a boarded up building, which I just about remember as a kid. And it was on, you used to come out of Hare Street from Power Street, cross Woolwich High Street and down to the ferry, and where the foot tunnel entrance is, it was the building opposite. It was just opposite there. And that was all wanting to be redeveloped, and so it was compulsory purchased, and the money went into a trust. This sort of left it sitting there until a suitable plot can be found. And that area was covered by the waterfront swimming pool, which is now being demolished, because that one leaked ever since they built it. Oh, what a shock. And so there's now a new swimming centre in Woolwich. I said Enon itself has ceased to be a church, but West Woolwich Baptist Church struggled on, although that dwindled down to about 3 or 4 little old ladies meeting, listening to cassette tapes. And then that was revived and built up to a slightly more healthy church now, but it's still very low in numbers. So this money was sitting in a trust fund for a suitable site, which was useful, because where the Baptists were arguing about Baptist churches on Thamesmead, that added weight to the fact we have a sum of money here, why can't we have a plot of land? And so eventually 2 plots of land were allocated to Baptist churches. One is the now called Emmanuel, Yarnton Way Baptist Church, was built, strangely enough, in Yarnton Way, and that was built by funds raised by the local Baptist churches, and this church was that money from Enon paid for this place. So we then have, back in the nearly 50 years ago, about 48 and a half, 49 years, something like that, we have our church appeared here, as you can see from the age of the cars in the picture. So, but both churches now are reaching their 50th anniversary clearly as churches, but because this is when it all happened. Now, because the word church has a split meaning, as I said earlier, legally churches have 2 different trust deeds that cover them. One is for the building and one is for the church itself, for the people. So our church deed here is coming up to the 50 years old for the people. But we can actually say, but our heritage is going back to these mid-1740s, because that's where the money came from. They raised a couple of £100 and built a church, and that money now paid for this place. So we do have that historic link here. So you're not in something that's only been around 10 years. You're not in something that's only been around 50 years. No, it was 50 years. It's been around nearly 300 years. We're talking of a big chunk of time. Yeah, I will admit the faces have changed over time, but you might notice something familiar in that picture. What are you sitting on? So the chairs are about 50 years old as well, so don't fidget. But then again, as a church here, we can say our history is even older than the 250, 300 years. We're looking at being just something like 2,000 years since Jesus walked on this earth. He was arrested, he died on our behalf on that cross. His story didn't end there at the cross, as some people like to make out. He rose from the grave. He gave hope to all those who believe, who trust in him. These are the people who make up the church, which is why we have the split meanings. Church membership isn't turning up occasionally for high days, for holidays, for special events such as hatching, matching or dispatching. That's what it means to belong to the local club. Being a church, part of a church is something different, it's something special. It's a special personal relationship with God, only possible through knowing Jesus. It means trusting in him, that he paid the penalty for our sins when he died on the cross. Trusting that he will teach and guide you through your life. Trusting that he will be there to introduce you to the Father when we meet him in heaven. To introduce you, is it going to be as a friend or as God's enemy? That's what church membership is about. That makes the church. As a believer in Jesus Christ and his work of salvation on the cross, there's nothing except you stopping you being part of that. Now next month, Derek is considering the life and works of Albert Henry Ross, who has some connection to Easter, which I must admit I don't recognise the name and I'm not sure what it is. But do join us, not on the first Monday, it'll be the 13th of April from 11 o'clock.
You go on the next one.
I can do. I'm pausing it for effect. Yes, sir. So yeah, that's our talk next month. Sorry, you're back to Derek. And I'll have to have another think about anything else I can do. So thank you all for listening, and I hope you've learnt something about this place around you and why it's so soggy when you walk outside.